World War II's most dangerous female soldier struck fear into the hearts of enemy troops, only to disappear without a trace in the chaos of 1944. Her lethal skills and strategic mind made her a legend, but the truth about her fate remained buried for half a century. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The blizzard that descended upon Denver that February night was unlike anything the city had seen in decades. Snow fell in thick, relentless curtains, transforming the urban landscape into something almost mythical. Street lamps cast eerie halos through the white darkness, their light diffused and scattered by the storm. Inside the children's hospital, the usual hum of medical equipment provided a stark contrast to the muffled silence of the snow-covered world outside. In room 417 of the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit, 12-year-old Abigail Moore lay motionless beneath thin hospital blankets. Her small frame seemed to disappear into the institutional bedding. Once bright eyes that had sparkled with mischief and curiosity now stared vacantly at the ceiling, clouded by weeks of aggressive illness. The girl everyone called Abby hadn't laughed in 17 days. Claire had been counting. The monitors beside her bed displayed a steady but concerning rhythm, numbers that David and Claire Moore had learned to interpret with the unwanted expertise of parents in crisis. David's calloused hands, rough from his welding work in Boulder, trembled slightly as he adjusted his daughter's blanket. The double shifts he'd been taking had left dark circles under his eyes, but he refused to leave Abby's side for longer than absolutely necessary. Claire sat in the vinyl chair beside the bed, a half-graded stack of papers abandoned weeks ago when she'd taken leave from her teaching position. Her mother, Ruth, still wearing her visitor's badge after 12 hours at the hospital, stood by the window watching the snow accumulate in the parking lot far below, where she knew Thor waited faithfully in their vehicle. At precisely 10:17 in the evening, the relative calm shattered. A high-pitched alarm pierced the sterile air, followed immediately by another, then another. The monitors above Abby's bed flashed angry red warnings as her oxygen saturation plummeted dangerously. Medical staff rushed into the room, their voices urgent but controlled. "Oxygen dropping to 78%, a nurse called out, her fingers flying across the equipment. The family was ushered into the waiting area, where they huddled together beneath the harsh fluorescent lighting. Through the observation window, they could see the medical team working frantically around their little girl. David pressed his palm against the glass, as if he could somehow reach through to her. Claire's fingers found her mother's hand, squeezing until her knuckles turned white. Ruth, drawing on decades of nursing experience, watched the monitors with growing dread. The numbers continued to fall despite the team's best efforts. 75, 72, 68. "Come on, Abby," she whispered, unconsciously reaching for the rosary in her pocket. "Fight, sweetheart. Fight." 6 stories below Abigail Moore's hospital room, a snow-laden Subaru sat partially buried in the hospital parking lot. Inside, Thor, a powerful German shepherd with intelligent eyes, paced anxiously across the back seat. Frost had formed intricate patterns on the windows, but the dog's body heat had melted small viewing portals through which he kept his unwavering gaze fixed on the hospital's main entrance. Thor had been Abby's loyal companion since she was 4 years old, their bond growing stronger with each passing year. Now, with the 12-year-old fighting for her life in the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit, hospital regulations kept him exiled to the vehicle, unable to be at her side when she needed him most. David Moore had reluctantly left the animal in the car 3 days ago when Abby's condition had suddenly deteriorated. Since then, the devoted shepherd had refused all food, his bowl of kibble untouched despite Claire's tearful attempts to coax him to eat during her brief visits to check on him. The security guards had grown accustomed to the dog's presence, occasionally stopping by to ensure the vehicle remained running with adequate heat. "Never seen anything like it," one guard had commented to Ruth when she'd come down earlier that day. "That animal knows something's wrong." Thor's behavior had become increasingly distressed as the hours passed. His ears remained perpetually pricked, rotating toward every distant sound that might signal Abby's presence. Occasionally, he would stand on his hind legs, pressing his front paws against the window, scanning the hospital entrance as if expecting his young companion to appear at any moment. As night fell and the blizzard intensified, Thor's agitation reached new heights. He circled the back seat restlessly, his nails clicking against the plastic floor mats. His powerful nose pressed against every crack in the windows, sampling the frigid air for any trace of Abby's scent. At precisely the moment the alarms began to sound in room 417, though Thor couldn't possibly hear them from this distance, the shepherd suddenly went rigid. His head lifted, ears forward, body completely still, except for the rapid rise and fall of his chest. Something had changed, something only he could sense. Then, as if responding to a distant call that no human ear could detect, Thor threw back his head and released a low, resonant howl. The sound started deep in his chest, building in intensity until it seemed to slice through the howling blizzard, through concrete and steel, through the very walls of the hospital itself. In the parking lot, a night shift nurse paused, shivering, as the haunting sound echoed across the snow-covered landscape. "That poor animal," she whispered, hurrying toward the hospital doors, unaware of the drama unfolding 6 stories above. The ordeal that consumed the Moore family had begun 6 months earlier, with what they thought was just a persistent flu. Abigail Moore's symptoms started subtly: fatigue that seemed excessive even for an active 12-year-old, followed by unexplained rashes that appeared and vanished like ghosts on her pale skin. By the time doctors diagnosed her with a rare autoimmune disorder, the illness had already established its unpredictable rhythm of hope and despair. David Moore's calloused hands, normally steady from years of precision welding in Boulder, now trembled whenever he signed another medical form. The burly welder had taken on double shifts at the fabrication shop, sometimes working 16 hours straight before driving through the night to reach Denver by morning. His supervisor had been understanding, but the mounting bills demanded sacrifice. "We'll get through this," he would whisper to Claire each night in the hospital corridor, though the dark circles under his eyes betrayed his exhaustion. Claire had reluctantly resigned from her teaching position at Mapleton Elementary after 14 years. The decision tore at her. She loved her 4th-grade classroom, but Abby needed her more. Now she spent her days in the sterile hospital room, reading aloud from Abby's favorite books when her daughter was conscious enough to listen. "The doctors say her white cell count improved slightly," Claire would report hopefully to family members, clinging to even the smallest positive indicators, like lifelines in a storm. Ruth, Claire's mother, had become the family's medical interpreter. The retired nurse, with 4 decades of experience, brought both practical knowledge and fierce advocacy to her granddaughter's bedside. Hospital staff quickly learned that Ruth's questions required thorough answers. Her expertise demanded respect. "The treatment protocol isn't working consistently," she noted in the small notebook she carried everywhere. Her responses are atypical. When doctors spoke in careful, measured terms, Ruth translated their cautious language for David and Claire. When nurses changed shifts, she ensured continuity of care with quiet authority. Her rosary beads were never far from her fingers, moving silently through practiced hands during the darkest hours. The family established an unspoken rotation. Someone was always with Abby. They slept in uncomfortable chairs, ate from vending machines, and showered in the hospital's family facilities. Their world contracted to room 417 and its immediate surroundings. Between crisis points, there were moments of normalcy that felt almost surreal. Watching game shows together, celebrating small victories like Abby keeping down solid food, or sharing jokes that momentarily lifted the weight of uncertainty. But these respites grew shorter as the weeks passed. The pattern became cruelly familiar: improvement followed by sudden decline, hope extinguished by emergency interventions, only to begin the cycle again. Through it all, the Moores remained united by love and desperation, their lives suspended between heartbreak and healing. The morning light filtered weakly through the hospital windows as another layer of snow accumulated outside. Ruth stood by the window, her weathered hands clutching a styrofoam cup of lukewarm coffee. The storm had intensified overnight, transforming Denver into a white fortress, isolating them further in their vigil. "That dog knows more than any of us," Ruth whispered, her eyes fixed on the parking lot, where Thor's silhouette was barely visible through the blizzard. "He senses when she's slipping." The retired nurse had witnessed countless medical miracles and tragedies throughout her career. But something about this connection between her granddaughter and the German Shepherd struck her as profound. Claire Moore looked up from her daughter's bedside, dark circles under her eyes betraying her exhaustion. "Mom, please," she murmured, not wanting Abigail to hear such talk, even in her sedated state. David, who had just returned from his overnight welding shift in Boulder, exchanged a nervous laugh with his wife. But Ruth's words lingered in the sterile air of room 417, impossible to ignore. Even Dr. Evelyn Grant had noticed something unusual during her morning downs. The chief of pediatric medicine paused longer than necessary while reviewing Abby's chart, her gaze drifting to the window where Thor maintained his vigil 6 stories below. "The dog's behavior has been noteworthy," Dr. Grant admitted cautiously. Something in her voice made the family look up. She didn't elaborate further, but her expression suggested she was wrestling with thoughts beyond standard medical protocol. As the days passed, Thor's behavior grew increasingly intense with each of Abby's setbacks. When her fever spiked Tuesday afternoon, the animal began barking incessantly, alarming other visitors in the parking area. When her oxygen levels dropped Wednesday night, his howls echoed through the snow-muffled hospital grounds. "It's just coincidence," David insisted, his calloused hands gripping the windowsill as he peered down at the loyal companion. But even he couldn't explain why Thor would suddenly grow agitated precisely 17 minutes before Abby's monitors would begin their warning beeps. One nurse, Deborah, began timing it. 14 minutes this time, she noted, checking her watch after Thor's barking episode preceded another drop in Abby's blood pressure. Claire found herself watching the parking lot as much as her daughter's monitors. "He's trying to tell us something," she whispered to Ruth one evening. "Something we're missing." Ruth nodded, fingering her rosary. "Animals sense things we can't," she replied. "Maybe instead of ignoring him, we should be listening." Outside, as if hearing their conversation, Thor paced the perimeter of his snow-covered vehicle, eyes never leaving the illuminated window of Abby's room, as if protesting something no one else could see. February 14th arrived, with a rare sense of normalcy in room 417. Abigail Moore's bedside table displayed a colorful array of Valentine's cards from her 6th-grade classmates at Boulder Elementary. Her pale face brightened as she sorted through them, lingering on one with a glittery red heart from her best friend Emma. "Look at this one, Mom," Abby whispered, her voice thin but animated for the first time in weeks. Claire Moore leaned in, grateful to see a spark in her daughter's eyes. The former teacher had spent countless nights in the uncomfortable hospital chair, her lesson plans long forgotten as Abby's illness consumed their lives. Ruth arrived mid-morning, carrying a small box of heart-shaped cookies she'd baked in the hospital's family kitchen. "Just a little something sweet," the retired nurse said, placing one in Abby's hand. Her granddaughter took a tentative nibble, the first solid food she'd shown interest in for days. David Moore appeared during his lunch break, still wearing his welding company's uniform. His weathered hands, usually steady from years of precision work, trembled slightly as he held up his smartphone. "Someone misses you," he said, playing a video of Thor romping through the snow-covered hospital parking lot, his German Shepherd paws kicking up white powder as he chased after a ball. Abby's laughter, a sound they hadn't heard in what felt like forever, filled the sterile room. "He looks so silly," she giggled, her thin fingers reaching toward the screen as if she could touch her loyal companion through the glass. The moment shattered without warning. Mid-laugh, Abby's eyes rolled back. Her small body suddenly went rigid before violent convulsions took hold. The cookie tumbled from her hand to the floor as monitors erupted in high-pitched alarms. Her oxygen levels plummeted dangerously, numbers flashing red on the display. Code blue. Room 417. A nurse's voice echoed through the intercom as medical staff rushed in, pushing the family aside. Claire stood frozen at the foot of the bed, her mind unable to process the abrupt transition from joy to terror. David pounded his fist against the observation window, shouting his daughter's name, as if his voice alone could pull her back from the edge. Ruth dropped to her knees in the corner, pulling the worn rosary from her pocket. Her lips moved in desperate prayer, the wooden beads clicking together as she clutched them. Her medical knowledge made the gravity of the situation all too clear. Abby was slipping away before their eyes. Dr. Evelyn Grant burst through the door, arcing orders as she moved swiftly to Abby's side. "Push 1 milligram of epinephrine," she commanded, her experienced hands already at work. The chief of pediatric medicine's face remained composed, but her eyes betrayed the urgency of the moment. Outside in the parking lot, 6 stories below, Thor suddenly stopped playing and turned toward the hospital, his ears alert, as if he could sense the crisis unfolding in room 417. The chaos inside room 417 was reflected in the hospital parking lot below. Thor, his fur dusted with snow, began to howl with such intensity that it pierced through the howling blizzard. The German Shepherd's barking escalated to a frantic pitch that triggered car alarms throughout the lot, creating a cacophony that drew the attention of everyone within earshot. "What in God's name is that racket?" demanded a security guard, trudging through knee-deep snow toward the Subaru, where Thor had been faithfully waiting for 3 days. The animal stood rigid, his eyes fixed on the hospital's upper floors, his posture communicating an urgency that transcended human language. When the guard approached, Thor didn't growl or retreat. He simply continued his desperate communication, as if pleading with anyone who would listen. Inside, Ruth clutched her rosary tighter as the alarms monitoring Abby continued their ominous warning. The retired nurse had spent decades in hospitals, and something about this situation stirred her professional instincts. Through the window, she could hear the distant sound of Thor's barking, mixing with the electronic wail of car alarms. "That dog knows," she whispered, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "He's trying to tell us something." David Moore looked up, his welder's hands trembling as he held his daughter's small fingers. "What are you talking about, Ruth?" "Thor's been with Abby since she was 4. He's more than just a pet. He senses things." Ruth turned to Dr. Evelyn Grant, who had just entered the room. "Bring the dog in. He's trying to warn us about something." The chief of pediatric medicine hesitated, hospital protocol warring with the desperation in the grandmother's eyes. "Mrs. Moore, I understand your concern, but animals aren't permitted in the ICU. The risk of infection—" "To hell with protocol!" Ruth's voice cracked with emotion. "My granddaughter is dying, and that dog knows something we don't." Claire, who had been silently stroking Abby's hair, looked up with tears streaming down her face. "Please," she whispered, "we've tried everything else." Hospital staff exchanged uncomfortable glances. A nurse named Deborah, who had been checking Abby's vitals, paused. "I've heard about animals sensing medical emergencies before they happen. My cousin's dog detected her cancer before the doctors did." Dr. Grant's expression remained neutral, but something flickered behind her professional facade. A memory, perhaps, or a regret. Though she dismissed Ruth's plea with a gentle but firm reminder of hospital policy, the grandmother's words had planted a seed that would soon take root in everyone's consciousness. Outside, Thor's howls grew more desperate as the night deepened and the blizzard raged on. Dr. Evelyn Grant stood frozen in the corridor outside room 417, the urgent pleas from Ruth echoing in her mind. As chief of pediatric medicine, she'd upheld hospital protocols religiously throughout her 15-year career. No animals in the ICU. It was non-negotiable. Yet something about this situation struck a painful chord. She glanced down at Abigail Moore's medical chart, her trained eyes scanning the vitals that continued to deteriorate despite their best interventions. The desperate family huddled together, David with his calloused hands from welding work, Claire with reddened eyes from sleepless nights, and Ruth clutching that worn rosary she never seemed to set down. "That dog knows something we don't," Ruth had insisted, her voice carrying the weight of her nursing background. 6 years earlier, in this very hospital, Evelyn had watched monitors flatline as her 8-year-old son Tommy slipped away. The memory still haunted her, not just the loss, but the knowledge that came after. Tommy's undiagnosed condition had produced subtle biochemical changes that a specially trained dog might have detected weeks before conventional medicine could. Grief had transformed into purpose. After Tommy's funeral, Evelyn had channeled her pain into establishing a small, experimental program for medical detection dogs. She'd personally sponsored several animals, including a particularly gifted German Shepherd puppy named Thor. "The dog's name is Thor?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely audible. Claire nodded, confusion crossing her tear-stained face. "Yes, he's been with Abby since she was 4. How did you—" Evelyn's heart raced as pieces clicked into place. After the program ended due to funding cuts, she'd arranged adoptions for the trained animals. Thor had been placed with a family in Boulder, the Moores. "I need to see him," the doctor said, already moving toward the elevator. In the parking lot, through swirling snow, she spotted the Subaru and the familiar silhouette inside. Thor's ears perked up as she approached, recognition dawning in his intelligent eyes. "It's you," she whispered, reaching a trembling hand toward him. "You've been watching over her all this time." The German Shepherd whined softly, pawing at the window, his attention divided between Evelyn and the hospital building where Abby fought for her life. Evelyn made her decision then. Protocol be damned. This wasn't coincidence. It was the second chance she never had with Tommy. Thor had been trained to detect the subtle biochemical markers of immune dysfunction, the very condition threatening young Abigail. "Come with me," she said, opening the car door. "We're going to break some rules." Dr. Evelyn Grant stared at the monitors, displaying Abigail Moore's vital signs, her mind racing back 6 years. The connection was unmistakable. This was the same German Shepherd she had personally trained after losing her son Tommy in this very hospital, a fact the Moore family knew nothing about. After Tommy died, Evelyn had channeled her grief into establishing a small, private program training medical detection dogs. Thor had been her star pupil, demonstrating an uncanny ability to detect subtle changes in human biochemistry that even sophisticated equipment sometimes missed. His sensitivity to seizures, blood sugar fluctuations, and immune responses had been remarkable. "I never thought I'd see him again," she whispered to herself, watching through the window as David paced the corridor while Claire sat motionless beside Ruth, who clutched her rosary with white knuckles. Thor had been carefully placed with the Moore family through an adoption agency when Abby was 4, shortly after her initial diagnosis. Evelyn had arranged it quietly, ensuring the family received a dog with exceptional abilities without revealing his full training. She believed some children needed more than medicine. They needed companions who understood their bodies better than they did themselves. "It wasn't coincidence," Evelyn confided to Deborah, the night nurse. "I reviewed hundreds of applications, but when I saw Abby's file, I knew Thor belonged with her." The pediatrician had followed Thor's progress from a distance, receiving occasional updates from the training center. What she hadn't anticipated was that the dog would end up back at her hospital, desperately trying to alert everyone to something they couldn't see. Outside in the parking lot, Thor's barking intensified. Through the falling snow, security cameras showed him pulling against his leash, which was tied to a nearby bench. His focus remained unwavering, directed at the exact window of room 417. Evelyn pulled Abby's chart closer, reviewing the medication list with newfound suspicion. Something wasn't adding up. Thor's behavior suggested he was detecting a threat to Abby that the medical team had overlooked. "He's not just anxious," she murmured. "He's trying to warn us." The chief of pediatric medicine made a decision that went against hospital protocol, but aligned with her instincts as both a doctor and a mother who had suffered loss. If anyone could help Abby now, it might be the very animal she had trained to detect what humans could not. Evelyn reached for the phone to call security. "I need you to bring the German Shepherd from the east parking lot to the pediatric ICU, she instructed. "And find Ruth Moore immediately. Tell her Thor might be Abby's best chance right now." Ruth's patience had finally reached its breaking point. The sight of her granddaughter, Abigail Moore, fighting for every breath was more than she could bear. With a determination born from decades of nursing experience, she made her decision. While the hospital staff were distracted by another emergency down the hall, Ruth slipped out to the parking lot, snow crunching beneath her worn boots. Thor recognized her immediately, his ears perking up as she approached the snow-covered Subaru. "Come on, boy," she whispered, clipping on his leash. "Abby needs you now." The German Shepherd moved with surprising stealth for his size as Ruth guided him through a service entrance. They narrowly avoided 2 orderlies and a cleaning cart before reaching the elevator. A young resident doctor gave them a puzzled look, but was too preoccupied with his charts to stop them. "You can't bring that animal in here," protested a nurse as Ruth and Thor emerged onto the 4th floor. But the elderly woman simply squared her shoulders and continued walking, her grip on the leash unwavering. "He's more than an animal," Ruth replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "He might be her only chance." They reached room 417 just as David and Claire were being ushered out by Dr. Evelyn Grant, who was explaining the latest treatment options in a low, somber tone. The conversation halted abruptly when Thor padded into the room, his nails clicking softly against the linoleum floor. "Mrs. Moore, this is completely against protocol," Dr. Grant began, but her objection faltered as she recognized the dog. Something shifted in her expression, recognition, then understanding. Thor moved directly to Abby's bedside, ignoring the protests of the medical staff gathering at the doorway. With gentle precision, he rested his head on the girl's chest, directly over her heart. The room fell silent as everyone watched the dog close his eyes and begin to breathe in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Deborah, the night nurse who had been monitoring Abby for 3 consecutive shifts, was the first to notice the change on the monitors. "Look," she whispered, pointing to the screens. "He's synchronizing with her." The erratic beeping that had filled the room began to steady. Abby's oxygen levels, which had been dangerously low, started to climb. Her breathing, previously shallow and irregular, deepened to match Thor's measured pace. Claire pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. David wrapped his arm around his wife's shoulders, his own eyes wide with disbelief. "I've never seen anything like this," Dr. Grant murmured, stepping closer to check the monitors herself. For the first time since Abby's collapse, the atmosphere in room 417 shifted from desperation to something that felt dangerously like hope. Thor remained perfectly still, his connection to the young girl transcending medical understanding. His presence accomplishing what medicine alone could not. The hospital's head of infection control burst into room 417, her face a mask of professional outrage. Dr. Patricia Winters pointed at Thor with a trembling finger, addressing Dr. Evelyn Grant rather than the Moore family. "This is absolutely unacceptable," she hissed. "A dog in the pediatric ICU? We have protocols for a reason." David Moore stepped forward, His welder's hands clenched into fists. "That dog just saved my daughter's life when your doctors couldn't," he said, his voice low but firm. Dr. Grant positioned herself between the administrator and Thor, who remained steadfastly beside Abigail's bed. "Patricia, I authorized this temporarily. Look at her vitals. They've stabilized completely since the animal arrived." "I don't care if she's dancing a jig," Dr. Winters retorted. "Hospital policy is absolute. Animals carry pathogens that could endanger every immunocompromised child on this floor." Claire approached her daughter's bed, placing a protective hand on Thor's head. The German Shepherd didn't move, his eyes fixed on Abby as if he alone understood what she needed. "Please," Claire whispered, her voice breaking. "Just give us some time." Ruth, who had been silently observing from the corner, suddenly straightened her back. The retired nurse stepped forward with the authority of someone who had spent decades in hospitals. "I worked infection control for 27 years, she said, fixing Dr. Winters with a steely gaze. "And I know that exceptions are made when benefits outweigh risks. My granddaughter was dying minutes ago." Hospital security appeared in the doorway, summoned by an anxious floor nurse. The tension in the room thickened as Dr. Winters conferred with them in hushed tones. Dr. Grant seized the moment to pull up Abigail's latest readings on the medical monitor. Oxygen saturation up 17%, heart rate normalized, blood pressure stabilizing, she announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. After what seemed like hours, but was merely minutes, the hospital's chief of medicine arrived, summoned by the escalating situation. He surveyed the scene, the Moore family forming a protective circle around Abby and Thor, the security personnel awkwardly waiting for instructions, and the two doctors locked in silent confrontation. 24 hours, he finally declared. "The dog stays for 24 hours, with strict hygiene protocols. After that, we reassess." Dr. Winters opened her mouth to protest, but was silenced by his raised hand. "Document everything," he instructed Dr. Grant. "Every vital sign, every interaction. This could be important." As the administrators retreated, David and Claire exchanged looks of cautious relief. They had won a small but crucial battle, a single day with Thor by Abby's side. None of them spoke the fear aloud. What would happen when those 24 hours expired? The storm had subsided momentarily, leaving the hospital corridors eerily quiet. David Moore paced the waiting area, his welder's hands clenched into fists, while Claire sat motionless beside her mother. Ruth fingered her rosary beads, her lips moving in silent prayer. The temporary reprieve with Thor had brought a fragile peace to room 417, but tension still hung in the air like the lingering scent of antiseptic. The elevator doors slid open with a soft ping. Hannah Moore strode purposefully toward them, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Dressed in a charcoal pantsuit with her blonde hair pulled into a severe bun, she looked every bit the insurance auditor she claimed to be. But the white-knuckled grip on her leather briefcase suggested something far more urgent than paperwork. "How is she?" Hannah asked, embracing her sister Claire. "Better, for now," Claire whispered. "Thor's with her." Hannah's eyebrows shot up. "The dog? In the ICU?" David nodded wearily. "Long story. Dr. Grant made an exception." Hannah glanced around the corridor, then lowered her voice. "We need to talk. Not here." They found an empty consultation room at the end of the hall. Hannah locked the door behind them and placed her briefcase on the table with deliberate care. The overhead fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her face as she entered a combination into the lock. "What I'm about to show you isn't supposed to exist," she said, extracting a thick manila folder. "I've been tracking suspicious insurance claims across 3 states. Abigail isn't just sick, she's been made sick." Ruth gasped. "What are you saying?" Hannah spread documents across the table, medical charts, pharmaceutical records, and internal memos marked confidential. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pointed to highlighted sections. Abby and 11 other children at this hospital were enrolled in what's listed as Standard Treatment Protocol A7. But there's nothing standard about it. She tapped a chemical formula. This is an experimental immunosuppressant that failed FDA approval last year. Claire's face drained of color. But we never consented to any trial. That's the point, Hannah replied grimly. The consent forms you signed for routine care contained buried language authorizing alternative therapeutic approaches. The hospital's been partnering with Meridian Pharmaceuticals to test rejected compounds by disguising them as conventional treatments. David slammed his fist on the table. They're using our daughter as a guinea pig? Hannah nodded solemnly. And Thor knew. Every time they administered the drug, he reacted, didn't he? Ruth's eyes widened with sudden understanding. That's why he howled before her collapse. He was trying to warn us. Outside, thunder rumbled as the storm gathered strength again. In the silence that followed, the four adults stared at each other, the terrible truth settling over them like a shroud. "What do we do now?" Claire whispered. Hannah closed her briefcase with a decisive click. "We fight." The conference room felt claustrophobic as Hannah Moore spread the documents across the table. David and Claire huddled close, their faces ashen under the fluorescent lights. Ruth clutched her rosary tightly, her knuckles white with tension. "These aren't standard treatments," Hannah explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "The hospital, working through MedCore insurance, has been enrolling vulnerable patients in unauthorized experimental trials." He pointed to a highlighted section of a confidential memo. "Abby was never supposed to be part of this," Claire gasped, covering her mouth with trembling hands. "But we signed consent forms for standard care only." "That's exactly the problem," Hannah replied, sliding another document forward. The consent forms were deliberately vague. They buried the experimental language in medical jargon no parent could reasonably understand. David slammed his fist on the table, causing the papers to jump. "They're experimenting on our daughter without telling us." The welder's voice cracked with rage and disbelief. Ruth leaned forward, her medical background allowing her to scan the technical details more effectively. "These compounds aren't even fully tested. They're designed to suppress autoimmune responses, but the dosages—" Her voice trailed off as comprehension dawned. "They're accelerating immune system failure," Hannah confirmed grimly. "The hospital gets research data, and the pharmaceutical company gets human trials without proper oversight." A sudden realization hit Claire. "Thor knew," she whispered. "Every time they administered those drugs, he would become agitated." David nodded slowly. "Remember 3 days ago, when that new medication was added to her IV? Thor went ballistic in the parking lot." "German Shepherds have over 300 million scent receptors," Ruth explained. "He could smell the change in her body chemistry. He was trying to warn us all along." Outside room 417, Thor lay with his head on his paws, alert despite his exhaustion. Dr. Evelyn Grant knelt beside him, stroking his fur gently. "You knew, didn't you?" she murmured. "Just like you knew with Tommy." The memory of her son brought fresh pain, but also clarity. The chief of pediatric medicine stood up with newfound determination. Back in the conference room, Hannah was outlining their options. "We have enough evidence to demand Abby be removed from the trial immediately, but we need to be careful. They'll try to cover this up." "How many others?" David asked, his voice hollow. Hannah's expression darkened. "From what I've found, at least a dozen children in this hospital alone, and potentially hundreds nationwide." Claire reached for her husband's hand. "We need to stop them." "We will," Ruth promised, her eyes flashing with the fierce protectiveness only a grandmother could muster. "Starting with saving our Abby." Dr. Evelyn Grant sat alone in her office, the glow of her computer screen illuminating her exhausted face. Hannah's documents lay scattered across her desk, each page more damning than the last. She couldn't shake the feeling that Abigail Moore's case wasn't an isolated incident. With trembling hands, Dr. Grant began cross-referencing patient records. searching for patterns similar to Abby's mysterious decline. The hospital database revealed what she feared most. 6 other children had exhibited nearly identical symptoms after receiving what were labeled as standard treatments from the same pharmaceutical supplier. 3 of them died, she whispered to herself, the weight of this revelation crushing her chest. Emma Reyes, age 8, Marcus Washington, just 10 years old, and Sophia Chen, 13, all gone within months of beginning their treatments. The chief of pediatric medicine scrolled through file after file, her medical training allowing her to spot the telltale markers that others might miss. Each child had shown initial improvement, followed by catastrophic immune system failure, exactly like Abby's case. When her office phone rang, Evelyn nearly jumped out of her skin. "Dr. Grant, it's Hannah Moore. I need to show you something else." 20 minutes later, Hannah spread additional documents across the desk. "These aren't just Denver cases," the insurance auditor explained, her voice low. "I've found identical protocols in hospitals across 5 states, all linked to the same insurance provider and pharmaceutical partner." Dr. Grant's mind flashed back to her son Tommy. Could his death have been part of this too? The thought made her physically ill. "This isn't just malpractice," Hannah continued. "It's systematic exploitation of vulnerable children for unauthorized drug trials. They're using insurance loopholes to bypass parental consent requirements." Outside the office window, snow continued to fall over Denver, the white blanket covering a city unaware of the horror unfolding within its premier children's hospital. "We need to stop these treatments immediately," Dr. Grant said, her professional demeanor cracking. "Every child currently receiving these protocols needs to be identified and monitored." Hannah nodded grimly. "The hospital administration won't make this easy. There are millions in research grants at stake." Dr. Grant thought of Thor, somehow sensing what trained medical professionals had missed. She thought of Abby, fighting for her life in room 417. She thought of the 3 children who hadn't survived. "I don't care about easy," she replied, standing up with newfound resolve. "This stops now, before we lose another child." What had begun as one family's nightmare had revealed itself as something far more sinister, a nationwide medical scandal that would soon shake the foundations of pediatric care across America. Shock rippled through the Moore family as Hannah's revelations sank in. David Moore slammed his fist against the wall of room 417, his weathered hands, calloused from years of welding, trembling with rage. "Take her off those drugs, now," he demanded, his voice cracking with emotion. Claire stood beside her husband, tears streaming down her face as she clutched Abby's small hand. "How could they do this to our daughter, without even telling us?" Dr. Evelyn Grant nodded solemnly. The pediatrician's own painful history with experimental treatments made this betrayal cut even deeper. "I'll handle the paperwork and take full responsibility," she assured them, already mentally preparing for the professional backlash she would face. Ruth, who had spent decades as a nurse, understood better than anyone the risks of suddenly discontinuing medication. "The withdrawal might be worse than the drugs themselves," she warned, clutching her rosary tightly. "We need to be prepared." The next 24 hours unfolded like a nightmare. As the experimental compounds began leaving Abigail's system, her body rebelled. Fever spiked, sending the 12-year-old into violent tremors. Monitors beeped frantically as her oxygen levels plummeted, then rose, then crashed again in unpredictable waves. Through it all, Thor remained steadfast. The German shepherd positioned himself against Abby's bed, his warm body pressed against the metal frame. Each time her breathing faltered, he would gently paw at her arm or whine softly, as if calling her back from some distant threshold. "He's synchronizing with her," Dr. Grant observed, watching Thor deliberately slow his breathing whenever Abby's became erratic. "I've seen this behavior before, but never so pronounced." Claire hadn't left her daughter's side, sleeping upright in an uncomfortable hospital chair. David alternated between pacing the hallway and standing guard at the door, as if expecting hospital administrators to burst in and force the experimental treatment to continue. By the 36th hour, something remarkable happened. Abby's fever broke. Her vitals, which had swung wildly for days, began to stabilize. The numbers on the monitor, which the family had watched obsessively, started trending toward normal ranges. "Look," Hannah whispered, pointing to the screen. "Her oxygen is holding steady." For the first time in weeks, a cautious optimism filled room 417. Ruth allowed herself a small smile as she stroked her granddaughter's forehead, now cool to the touch. David's shoulders relaxed slightly as he exchanged a hopeful glance with his wife. Thor, sensing the shift, rested his muzzle on the edge of Abby's bed, his intelligent eyes never leaving her face. When Abby's fingers twitched slightly, reaching instinctively toward his fur, the family collectively held their breath. "She's fighting back," Claire whispered, daring to hope at last. "Our girl is coming back to us." The story broke on a Wednesday morning. A junior reporter from the Denver Chronicle, tipped off by a night shift nurse, published a small article about a German shepherd who had seemingly predicted a young patient's medical crisis. By noon, the piece had gone viral. Dr. Evelyn Grant was in the middle of her rounds when her phone began buzzing incessantly with notifications. The hospital's PR department was in chaos. Within hours, the story of Abigail Moore and her loyal companion Thor had captured the public's imagination. "This is a clear violation of patient confidentiality," fumed the hospital administrator, pacing the length of the conference room. "We need to contain this immediately." Claire and David Moore sat silently, holding hands across the table as the hospital's legal team outlined their options. The message was clear: sign a non-disclosure agreement, remove Thor from the premises, or face potential legal action for violating hospital protocols. "My granddaughter is alive because of that dog," Ruth interjected, her voice trembling with barely controlled anger. She clutched her rosary tightly, a habit that had intensified during Abby's hospitalization. "And now you want to separate them?" Outside Children's Hospital, 3 news vans had already set up camp despite the lingering snow. By evening, that number had doubled. Journalists huddled in the cold, broadcasting live updates about the 12-year-old girl whose life had been saved by her dog's extraordinary intuition. Hannah arrived with reinforcements, not just her briefcase of damning documents, but a lawyer specializing in patient rights. "They're trying to silence us because they're terrified of what we know," she whispered to Claire in the hallway. "But this is bigger than just Abby now." Social media erupted with hashtags. #RoomForThor and #AbbyandThor trended nationally. Former patients began sharing stories of suspicious treatments and unexplained complications. The hospital's phone lines were jammed with calls from concerned families. In room 417, oblivious to the storm brewing around her, Abby slept peacefully with Thor curled at her feet. The dog's presence had been temporarily authorized under compassionate care exceptions, while the administration scrambled to manage the PR disaster. Dr. Grant found herself caught between worlds, loyal to her institution, but haunted by the mounting evidence of wrongdoing. She stood at the window of her office, watching the growing media encampment below. "They're threatening to fire me," she admitted to David when they passed in the corridor. "But I've lost one child already. I won't be part of losing another." By nightfall, the first national news crews arrived. The invisible war that had been fought in silence for months was now being broadcast into living rooms across America. What had begun as one family's desperate battle had transformed into something much larger, a reckoning that would shake the medical establishment to its core. The relentless vigil had continued for 7 straight days. Thor had barely left Abby's side since being allowed into room 417, his watchful eyes constantly monitoring her every breath, his ears perking up at the slightest change in the beeping monitors. The German shepherd had refused most food, accepting only small amounts of water when Deborah, the night nurse, insisted. It happened just after 3 in the morning. David Moore had finally succumbed to exhaustion on the small cot in the corner, while Claire dozed uncomfortably in the visitor's chair. Ruth had stepped out momentarily to call Hannah about the latest developments in their case against the hospital. Thor, who had been resting his head on the edge of Abigail's bed, suddenly tried to stand. His legs trembled violently before giving way completely. The loyal companion collapsed with a soft whimper beside the bed, his powerful body finally surrendering to days of sleepless vigilance. The sound alerted Deborah, who rushed in to find the animal breathing shallowly on the floor. "We need help in here," she called out, pressing the emergency button. Two orderlies appeared, unsure how to handle a medical emergency for a dog inside the hospital. "Get Dr. Grant," Deborah instructed, kneeling beside Thor, "and page the on-call veterinarian from the detection dog program." The commotion stirred something in Abby. For the first time in days, her eyelids fluttered open. Despite her weakness, the 12-year-old shifted toward the edge of the bed, her pale hand reaching down toward her fallen protector. "Thor," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "you gave me your strength. Let me give some back." Her small fingers found their way into his thick fur. The connection seemed to send a visible current between them, something the medical staff would later struggle to explain in their reports. The monitors tracking Abby's vital signs suddenly showed remarkable improvement. Her oxygen levels, which had been dangerously low for days, climbed steadily. Her heart rate stabilized. Even more astonishingly, Thor's breathing began to regulate. His eyes opened, finding Abby's gaze. The dog's tail thumped weakly against the floor. Dr. Evelyn Grant arrived moments later, stopping short at the doorway. The scene before her defied medical explanation. Patient and animal seemingly healing each other through touch alone. "I've never seen anything like this," she murmured to Deborah. Claire awakened to find her daughter conscious and alert for the first time in weeks. David jolted upright, disbelieving the sight before him. When Ruth returned, she simply nodded, as if she had expected nothing less. "They're connected," the grandmother said quietly. "Always have been." By morning, both Abby and Thor had stabilized. The hospital staff could only watch in stunned silence, witnessing a recovery that would soon become part of medical legend. "Dog detects what doctors can't," blazed across the front page of the Denver Post. Within 24 hours, the story of Abigail Moore and her faithful German Shepherd had been picked up by every major network. Thor's unwavering vigil and the shocking revelations about unauthorized drug trials created a perfect storm of public outrage. Claire Moore's phone rang constantly with interview requests. David, exhausted from double shifts and hospital vigils, found himself speaking to reporters in the hospital parking lot. "This isn't just about Abby anymore," he told a CNN correspondent. "How many other families are going through this without knowing why?" The question resonated across America. By week's end, 17 families from 8 states had come forward with eerily similar stories. Children with rare conditions who had experienced sudden, inexplicable declines after receiving what they believed were standard treatments. Ruth, who had initially been dismissed as a superstitious grandmother, became an unexpected spokesperson. Her medical background lent credibility to her appearances on morning shows. "Trust your instincts," she urged parents nationwide. "And sometimes, trust your pets." Thor knew something was wrong long before any of us did. The insurance company that had approved the experimental drugs initially released a terse statement denying wrongdoing. But as Hannah's documents circulated among investigative journalists, their position became untenable. 3 board members resigned in a single day. At Children's Hospital, the administration placed 4 doctors on administrative leave pending investigation. Dr. Evelyn Grant, though not implicated in the scandal, faced intense scrutiny for her decision to allow Thor into the ICU. "I would make the same choice again," she stated firmly at a staff meeting. Sometimes protocol must yield to humanity. Federal health officials arrived in Denver to examine records. The FDA launched a formal inquiry into the drug trials, focusing particularly on consent procedures and reporting of adverse effects. State medical boards in 12 states opened parallel investigations. For the Moore family, the national attention brought both validation and exhaustion. Abby, still recovering but growing stronger each day, watched the news coverage from her hospital bed, with Thor at her side. "I don't understand why they're calling me brave," she whispered to her companion. "You're the brave one." The first real crack in the system appeared when a whistleblower from within the pharmaceutical company that manufactured the experimental drugs came forward. Documents revealed that negative results had been systematically buried and warnings from early trials ignored in pursuit of fast-track approval. As spring arrived in Denver, melting away the last of the winter snow, the scandal had grown into what the Washington Post called the most significant medical ethics breach of the decade. And at the center of it all remained a girl and her dog, whose bond had exposed a truth that might otherwise have remained hidden forever. The press room buzzed with anticipation as Denver Children's Hospital prepared to announce what many considered impossible just weeks earlier. Under the glare of television lights, Dr. Evelyn Grant stood at the podium, her posture reflecting both professional authority and personal transformation. "Today marks a new chapter in pediatric care," she began, her voice steady despite the emotion visible in her eyes. "I'm proud to announce the creation of our medical detection dog program, inspired by the extraordinary work of one very special German Shepherd." Thor sat quietly beside Abigail Moore, his alert eyes scanning the room as cameras flashed. The dog's coat gleamed under the lights, though observant journalists noticed the slight thinning around his muzzle, a testament to his unwavering vigil during those critical days in room 417. Behind them, David and Claire Moore watched with a mixture of pride and lingering disbelief. The welder's calloused hands rested protectively on his daughter's shoulder, while his wife dabbed at tears that refused to stop flowing. Ruth, clutching her ever-present rosary, nodded approvingly at each mention of Thor's contributions. "This program," Dr. Grant continued, "will train dogs to detect subtle physiological changes that our most advanced equipment sometimes misses. What we witnessed with Thor wasn't a miracle. It was science we hadn't yet understood." Hospital administrators, many of whom had fought against Thor's presence just weeks earlier, now stood in somber agreement. The institution's reputation had suffered, but this initiative offered a path toward redemption. When Abby was invited to speak, a hush fell over the room. Her frame, still thin but no longer fragile, moved deliberately toward the microphone. Gone was the deathly pallor that had haunted her hospital bed. In its place was a determined glow that commanded attention. "6 weeks ago, I couldn't breathe on my own," she said, her voice stronger than anyone expected. "Today, I'm here because someone believed in something that couldn't be measured by machines." She reached down to stroke Thor's head. "What saved me wasn't just medicine. It was love and an instinct nobody wanted to believe." Hannah stood at the back of the room, her briefcase clutched tightly. The insurance auditor's expression remained guarded. She knew better than anyone that this victory, while significant, was just the beginning of a larger battle. As questions poured in from reporters, Abby's story spread across social media platforms. By evening, hospitals in 3 other states had contacted Dr. Grant about establishing similar programs. That night, as the Moore family returned home for the first time in months, Thor trotted directly to Abby's bedroom, circling 3 times before settling at the foot of her bed. A guardian now recognized, respected, and finally understood. The Justice Department's black SUVs arrived at Denver Children's Hospital on a crisp morning, their presence sending ripples of anxiety through the administrative offices. Agents in dark suits carried boxes of evidence as Hannah Moore stood in the lobby, her briefcase containing the documents that had blown the case wide open. 47 children, Hannah explained to the lead investigator, her voice steady despite her anger. Not just Abby, but 47 kids across 16 states, all subjected to these trials without proper consent. The scale of the scandal was breathtaking. What began with Abigail Moore's near-death experience had uncovered a nationwide web of pharmaceutical testing on vulnerable children. Claire and David sat beside their daughter during a closed-door testimony, watching as she recounted her experience with remarkable composure for a 12-year-old. "I kept telling them something was wrong," Abby said, her once frail frame now stronger, though still bearing the marks of her ordeal. But nobody listened until Thor made them hear. The German Shepherd had become inseparable from his young companion. His muzzle showed patches of gray, a testament to the stress of his vigil, but his eyes remained alert and protective as he lay at Abby's feet during interviews. Ruth, who had first insisted on bringing Thor into room 417, became a fierce advocate for families. Her medical background proved invaluable as she helped parents understand the technical aspects of what had been done to their children. "They preyed on our desperation," she told a group of families gathered in a hotel conference room. "They knew we'd try anything to save our kids." Dr. Evelyn Grant faced her own reckoning. Though not implicated in the trials, she struggled with her role in the hospital hierarchy that had allowed such abuses. Her testimony before a Senate subcommittee was damning. "I lost my son because we didn't listen to the warnings," she said, her voice breaking. "I nearly watched history repeat itself with Abby Moore." Class action lawsuits mounted as families from across the country joined forces. The media dubbed it the Thaw effect, the recognition that sometimes instinct trumps institutional wisdom. Television crews followed Thor and Abby as they visited other affected children in hospitals nationwide. David, still working his welding job in Boulder, often marveled at how their private tragedy had transformed into a movement. "We just wanted to save our daughter," he told Claire one evening. "Now we're saving others too." For Hannah, vindication came when federal prosecutors announced criminal charges against 3 pharmaceutical executives and 2 hospital administrators. The insurance auditor who had risked her career now stood at the forefront of healthcare reform. "This isn't just about accountability," she told reporters outside the courthouse. "It's about changing a system that values profits over patients." 6 months after Abigail Moore's ordeal, Denver's Children's Hospital unveiled the Tommy Grant Medical Detection Dog Program with a ribbon-cutting ceremony that drew national attention. Dr. Evelyn Grant stood at the podium, her voice steady despite the emotion visible in her eyes. She spoke of her son Tommy, whose memory now lived on through a program that would train dogs to detect medical emergencies before machines could register them. Thor, his coat less lustrous and his gait slightly slower, padded across the stage wearing a special vest. The German Shepherd's muzzle had begun to gray, but his eyes remained alert and watchful. Dr. Grant knelt beside him, pinning the program's first honorary badge to his vest while cameras flashed. David and Claire Moore watched from the front row, their hands clasped tightly together, the financial burden of Abby's treatment now eased by a settlement from the insurance company. "What happened in room 417 wasn't just a miracle," Dr. Grant told the assembled crowd. "It was science we hadn't yet understood." 1 year to the day after her life had hung in the balance, Abby stood before a congressional committee in Washington. Now 13, she appeared stronger, though still slender in her navy blue dress. Thor sat faithfully at her side as she testified about the unauthorized drug trials that had nearly claimed her life. "I'm alive because my dog knew something was wrong before the doctors did," she stated, her voice clear in the hushed chamber. Ruth, seated behind her granddaughter, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, while Hannah sat beside her, a thick folder of evidence on her lap. The resulting legislation, known informally as Abby's Law, established new transparency requirements for pediatric medical treatments nationwide. 3 pharmaceutical executives faced criminal charges, and 47 families received acknowledgement of the harm done to their children. On the anniversary of her discharge each year, Abby and Thor make a pilgrimage back to the hospital. The staff know to expect them, clearing a path to room 417, which now bears a small plaque commemorating what happened there. While Thor has slowed considerably with age, he still walks the hospital corridors with dignity, occasionally stopping to comfort other children. In their most private ritual, Abby kneels beside Thor in that room, her fingers tracing the wall where her bed once stood. "You didn't just save me," she whispers to her loyal companion. "You saved us all." The story of the girl and her dog has become legend, not just a tale of survival, but of a bond that transcended medical understanding and changed healthcare for generations to come.